Bro. Now, have you had enough chat? Photographer, sit down. So, just like to welcome you all here. For those of you who don't know, I think I know pretty much everyone here. My name is Martin Costello. And yeah, Martin. I have no questions, Anne, until the end. I suppose the way I'm going to give the talk this evening is just to kind of run through. I've been doing a bit of research on the Costellos for the last year or so, and I'm kind of going to go through it in more or less chronological order of how I kind of came about it. But I suppose firstly I'll just give you a preamble of what we're going to cover. So we're going to cover what's called autosomal DNA, which I'm sure you all know about. It's you see the ads on TV for Ancestry.com and all these kind of things. That the type of test they do is what's called autosomal. We have what's called surname projects and YDNA. We'll have the earliest Costellos we could find in Kilkenny. Then our New Jersey cousins, who are brand new. We have some going through some of the Costellos of Goodwin's Gardens, which is this big chart all along the wall here. These are all the descendants of Pierce Costello and Margaret Duggan. We also then will be covering our Australian cousins, which we've new Australian cousins. We had some previously, but we've some more now. And we have three famous Barry connections. We have two Peters and a Kevin. And so see if any can figure that out before we get there. So I suppose before we start, the main reason I'm here is because my dad, Seamus, produced this book back in '95. That lad there, and so he really was the inspiration for this. I suppose he got a huge amount of information from both Paddy Costello and also Margaret Moore, and I suppose I want to acknowledge the three of them. And I suppose the other reason I'm doing it is for this lad here, my little 4-month-old, also Seamus Costello. So we'll tip on. So the Ancestry test, when you get it, you spit in your tube and you send it off and you're waiting on your results, and what most people are interested in is this here, the ethnicity estimate. And so you think this is going to be the most exciting thing you've ever seen, and what you get is this. And so this is my original ethnicity estimate, which was about 68% Ireland and Scotland, 15% Great Britain, I think it was 6% Scandinavia and 5% Western Europe. But they then did an upgrade. So this was based on 3,000 reference samples. They then upgraded that to 16,000 reference samples, and my ethnicity estimate changed to this, which is 100% Irish, Leinster in Ireland, that's based in Laois and Kilkenny, Munster, North Munster, and that's East Cork and Waterford. And so if you zoom in on that area, you'll see that it's this area here, which is pretty much County Kilkenny. And all my direct ancestors that I've found are pretty much all from Kilkenny, or one town's land over the border. So that's, to me anyway, it seems fairly accurate. So there's three different types of DNA. You have autosomal, YDNA, and mitochondrial DNA. And I suppose this is the YDNA or the autosomal DNA is found in your first 22 pairs of chromosomes, and so when you do the ancestry test, this is the DNA that they're looking at. If you do a YDNA test, they're looking at just this little lad here, and you have to be a man to do that, because men have an X and a Y and women have two X's. And then the mitochondrial DNA is found in the mitochondria, which is the power unit of the cell, if the doctors will correct me. But basically autosomal DNA will only go back about 200 to 250 years. After that it's pretty much useless, because you share so much of that type of DNA with practically everyone. But it's quite accurate up to 200 or 250 years. The YDNA, which is the other one we'll be talking about tonight, is on your paternal line only, but goes back about 200,000 years. The mitochondrial also does the same, but that's only on your mother's line. So this is maybe a slightly easier graph to understand. So the YDNA, as I say, comes up here and it goes way off up there, thousands of years, all the way back to your hundreds of great-grandfathers, and mitochondrial does the same here on your mother's side, but the autosomal DNA, the ancestry test, will show you, so these are your great-great-grandparents, your 3 times great-grandparents, and your 4 times great-grandparents. And if this great-great-grandfather or 4 times great-grandfather had a brother, then that brother, if they had any children, it comes all the way down here, and if that person tests and you test, you will come up as a match for each other on ancestry. And so that's basically how it works. So it's the matches really you quickly discover are actually the most interesting thing. And so this is where you'll, if you do it, one of these tests, this is where you actually end up spending most of your time. As I said, this is a couple of minutes, the ethnicity estimate, but it's the matches are the most interesting thing. This one here is an uncle who's not too far away from me here. It's kind of hard to see here, but this says that we share these CM. So CM stands for centimorgans, and so if you tested me, I would have basically 7,000 centimorgans. And so what these matches are doing is trying to figure out how many centimorgans you share with anybody else. So I share 1,600 centimorgans with this lad here, and so that basically means that he's either first cousin or an uncle, and he's my uncle. So basically, if you have children, so a parent to a child, you split the amount of centimorgans. So you have 3,500 roughly. If you have a grandparent to a child or an uncle to a child, then you have about 1,700. And then each step further away you go, you cut in half the amount of centimorgans you share. And so basically, by the time you get down, so my third and fourth cousins here share 136 centimorgans with them, 128, and by the time you get down here to the fourth and sixth cousins, I'm only sharing 60, 50, and I have 30,000 matches on Ancestry. But really, only the first maybe 200 or so are ever going to be of any use. The others are far too distant to ever be able to figure anything out with. And the thing is, I actually know pretty much who all these people are. So I have, this is on my Delaney side, Murphy, Byrne, Rafter, possible Fitzpatrick, Rafter, Byrne. And so you can see, if I go into this person here, for instance, and I look at their connection to me, I can also see all the other people that we're both connected to. So you can start to quickly branch out and figure out where your connections are. And really what you're looking for is somebody who has a nice good tree. So someone who has a tree with 4 people, or this lad here who has a tree with 3 people, are pretty much useless to you. Colin might fill out his tree. It's okay for me, I know who he is, but other people won't. But basically, that's the basics of the autosomal DNA. I'm going to save the kind of examples of it till the end of the talk. But just to show you, this is myself here, that's my dad Seamus, my granddad Eamon, and then Eamon was John's son, Michael's son, again John's son, James, and Pierce. So Pierce is our most distant known ancestor. It's a bit blurry there, but he was born in 1713 and died in 1798. So he's really the one you just need to remember. He's over there on the wall, just behind the screen. And so all these people on that wall, as I say, are all, there's 1,000 people there at least, and they're all descended from Pierce. And the vast majority of people in this room are descended from Pierce. So what I'm going to talk about now is the surname project. So when I was doing the autosomal DNA, I was trying to figure it out. I was trying to understand what hopefully I've explained to you, but if I haven't, so I was watching a lot of YouTube videos and that, trying to figure out how it works and how to kind of make sense of it. And I started hearing people talk about these surname projects, and so they started talking about the YDNA. So the thing about Irish surnames is that Irish surnames go back pretty much 1,000 years, so they're some of the oldest surnames in the world. A lot of other countries would have surnames that are a lot kind of more recent. So if you had a Swedish surname, Swedish people used to, and I think it's Iceland they still do, it's what's called a patronymic system. So you have and so Colum's son would be Eamon Colum's son, and so Eamon has a son David, and so that David is David Eamon's son, and so the surname changes every generation. But in Ireland, our generation, so Costello or whatever the surname is, goes back pretty much 1,000 years in most cases. That's quite unusual in most of the world. But as a result, this YDNA, which also goes back thousands and thousands of years, means that you can hopefully meld the two of them together. And so there was a man in Galway called, I think I'm going to butcher the pronunciation here, but it's Dubhaltach Mac Pirshig, and he was around in the 1660s and created a huge, it's called the Great Book of Irish Genealogy, and he went through all the major families and wrote down all their descendants as far back as he could go. He had lots of manuscripts and records which are now lost, but he compiled them into this great book. And so a lot of the families that are trying to research their surname will go to Dubhaltach and see what can he tell them, where does it, where might their ancestors be. We can use the YDNA tree, so if you have lots of people who have tested, you can then connect them together, because you know where your connection is by doing the YDNA test. You can actually tell in terms of time how far it is you're separated. And so by using those together, you can try and see, can you connect it with the historical lineages, and see actually maybe is there somebody that has a direct lineage to, let's say, a Costello that's in that manuscript, and then you'd say, right, well, then we can go all the way back to the start of the Costello surname. So there is a couple of different things in terms of, so that's the nice, neat case scenario. So if it's all neat and easy, you'll get somebody who has that lineage, you go all the way back, and then you just figure out your different branches when people branched off that tree, and you'll be able to create this nice tree. But normally what you'll find is that at the 1,000 years ago, you'll find that people aren't related within that 1,000 years, they're related further back. And so if they're related further back, and they all have the same, so if you have lots of Costellos, and they've all done the test, and yet some of them are related within 1,000 years, but others are related before that, it means that their ancestor, somebody's ancestor wasn't a Costello, basically. Or else that they've got the surname, they've inherited the surname, or they've taken that surname for themselves. So you have what's called NPEs, which are non-paternal events, and so they by and large will determine whether you have a single ancestor that started the Costello surname, or you have multiple ancestors or multiple people kind of arriving and taking that surname on for themselves. NPEs are things like somebody comes along and we call him maybe the postman, gets in the way. And so you have maybe McCarthy blood instead of Costello blood, but you have the Costello name. Or you would have maybe you had a particularly prominent lord or warrior, and people thought he was a great lad and decided a lot of these warriors or people who lived on the land might say, well, he's a great lad to be associated with, we'll take his name. The other thing you also have is adoptions. So again, you have people who should have the Costello, they have the Costello name, but they don't have the Costello blood or the Costello genes. And so the whole point of the surname project is to try and figure out, do we have just one lineage, or have we lots of scattered lineages? If we have lots of scattered lineages, can we figure out which one matches with the historical records, if any of them do, if it's possible? And if not, then can we just start branching them out and figure out who's connected to who? So the supposed origins of the Costello name, there's two main theories. So there was, the first one is that there was a guy called Jocelyn de Angulo, and he had a son who they called Mac Costello, and this is a kind of an Irish derivation of Jocelyn. So Mac Costello became Mac Costello, and then that was translated into Mac Costello, and the Mac was dropped and ended up with Costello. The second theory then is that Gilbert, who was the son of Jocelyn, had a son called Hostello, and his descendants were Mac Ostello, the H was dropped, and then that in time became Costello. Personally, I think the first theory makes a lot more sense when you understand Irish. I think this is maybe something made up by an American or understand that this is the way it would have come into being, I think. So you have the Costellos of the west of Ireland, and so really what we're trying to figure out is, so the Costellos of the west of Ireland are supposedly the descendants of that original Jocelyn. So Jocelyn de Angulo came in 1171 with Hugh de Lacy and became the first Baron of Navan. He would have came from a place called Angle, so that's where de Angulo comes from, so he was from Angle. Angle is just, if you're ever on the ferry into Pembrokeshire, you pass a little castle on your way, and that's the castle of Angle. So Jocelyn came over, he had 3 sons with him, Gilbert, Philip and William. They also inherited lands in Meath, but then they were all bold boys. In 1195 they were outlawed for treason. In 1206 King John pardoned them, but before 1206 Gilbert said he was going to go west, and he fought with the King of Connaught, not with him, or not against him, he fought for him. And he actually built a castle for him in a place called Caelish, which is just outside Ballyshannon in Donegal. He built the castle in 1212, and then the O'Neills from the north came down and attacked the castle, burnt it, and killed him in the following year. So he obviously didn't do too good a job of the castle. The other son, Philip, in 1206 went back and inherited Jocelyn's lands in Navan, and he's supposedly the founder of the Nangle surname, and Nangle apparently has a derivation in Cork called Nagle. They're supposedly the same surname. So if we have this one singular Costello ancestor, we should also find that we're related to Nangles and Nagles in this YDNA. You then have this, the other son, William, he and his children settle in Meath, but then we have Miles Bregach Macushla, who ended up dying in 1259, but he was a grandson of William. He settled in a place called Castlemore in County Mayo, which is actually now in County Roscommon, just to be confusing, but it's just outside Ballahadreen. And so Castlemore became the seat of the Costellos for the next few hundred years. There was a few of, so there was a Jordan Macushla, and he was particularly prominent, so his children decided to call themselves Mac Jordan rather than Mac Costello. And the same with the Mac Philip and Waldron. So again, these are other people that, if we were the original Costellos that came over, we should be related to these Mac Jordans, Mac Phillips and Waldrons from Mayo. And so those are the kind of names we should be looking for in this YDNA test. There was a crowd called the Dillons who ended up taking over all the land of the Costellos in Mayo. They kind of did it in a bit of a sneaky way. They said, we'll look after that for you during the Reformation. We'll give it back to you when everything calms down. Everything calmed down. We'll have land to it now. So they lost a huge amount of their land. They had a big segment of East Mayo. It's actually still called the Barony of Costello. That was pretty much, so all the area around Knock and Ballyhaunis, all that, that was all originally Costello land. But there were still Costellos in Castlemore up to the 1860s. And they eventually sold up then. So if we can find some of the ancestors of the crowd who sold up and do a test on them, it's likely that they're some of these original Costellos. If all or any of this is true, this is the story that's most likely to be true. It's only a theory. It's taken from this double talk from Fiershig, who says that he was right either. So confusion. This is, so when you get your YDNA result, your YDNA result on its own is incredibly boring. It's just a series of numbers, and the numbers really mean nothing to you. So what you do is you join a project. So this is the Costello project, and so this here is me, Costello. This is my ancestor, Pierce Costello, born 1713, died 1798, and we have Kilkenny, County Kilkenny. And so this is my line of my DNA. So you say, well, what the hell is all this? So what all these numbers on the top are, these are pointers to a specific section of your YDNA. And at that section, you have what are called a short tandem repeat. Don't worry, you don't need to remember any of this, but basically what it means is that there's a section of your DNA which is AGAT, and it's repeated 10 times. So this one here, that's this yoke here is here, and so that's repeated. Well, most people actually in this Costello line have it 11 times, and this one person here actually has it 10 times. And so that's, when you have a difference in the number, it's a mutation, and you basically have a mutation pretty much once every 100 years. And so depending on the amount of mutations that you have, you can pretty much date when you separated from each other. Oh, this is clear as mud. So basically, you have some people here who have tested very far. So you have these people in green, like yourself, and a couple of these others have tested very far. But as you can see here, well, it's kind of hard to see, it's a bit blurry, but all these numbers are all the same. And it's only these ones that are in colour are actually different. So the vast majority of these people's DNA is exactly the same. You see the same here, and you see the same here. And so there's only one or two little variations. What you have is down here is a bit more messy, and so these people are unlikely to be related. These ones might be, are closely related. Everyone's related, it's just a matter of how closely you're related. And so that's the basics of it. I won't labour that point too much. It gets very technical and can get a lot more technical. But this little figure here is what's called your haplogroup. And my haplogroup is a thing called RPH4705. You don't need to remember it, but that's what it is. So all the Costellos and most men in Ireland, and so this is only your paternal lines, nothing to do with the DNA you've inherited from your mother. It's only from your father, and it's only from my Costello grandfathers. I have lots of other male grandfathers and great-great-grandfathers, but it's nothing to do with any of them. It's just what I've inherited from my Costello great-great-grandfathers. And so 200,000 years ago, like everybody else in the world, we started off in Africa. And so this is like a tree. It's pretty much actually like that big tree that's on the wall there. You start off with one person at the top, and each time you go down you have a branch, and it can branch out massively. Below this atom there are 138,000 branches on the tree. So the first branch that we moved on to was the B branch 130,000 years ago. We then moved on to the C branch 68,000 years ago. We then went on to the F branch 66,000 years ago. Now you'll notice that we skipped D and E. That's because people with the D and E DNA went to other places. D went to Asia, and E is actually these few here up in North Africa. And so we then went on to K 47,000 years ago, T 44,000 years ago, and then we went to R 31,000 years ago. Then R splits into R1 and 2, and we're R1, which is 28,000 years ago. And so this is, as I say, it's the track of where our ancestors came from and how they ended up getting to Ireland. When they were in R1, 23,000 years ago, R1 splits between R1A and R1B. R1A goes up into this sort of area here, and R1B, we were in the Caucasus 23,000 years ago. This is one of the other haplogroups that we didn't become. It's called the I haplogroup, and they ended up being around most of the Mediterranean. And most of the I haplogroup actually ended up going to Scandinavia, but a group of them ended up coming to Ireland, and they were actually the first people to come to Ireland. And so 12,000 years ago, the first males came to Ireland, and they were hunter-gatherers. But at the same time, we were still over in the Caucasus. We weren't anywhere near Ireland. We then became this M269. So as you can see here, the pointer is gone, but you can see here that these are some sub-branches in between, but eventually we become M269, and so M269 was all around this Black Sea area, and it's part of what's called the Yamna or the Yamnaya culture. And this is a very kind of prominent culture at that period. They basically brought the Bronze Age to Europe. They would have been cattle herders, and as they came across, they would have turned into what was called the Bell Beaker culture and stuff like that. But they would have swept across Europe over the next couple of thousand years, and they by and large replaced all the other people that were here before. You have this G haplogroup, which were our Neolithic farmers in Ireland. Again, we were still stuck over in the Caucasus, but eventually we got on the move, and 4,500 years ago we were actually this P312. The U106 was another major branch at that time, and they went to the east of the Rhine, we went to the west. Then 3,000 years ago we have we're actually this big long number here, the BY196132, which again you don't need to remember, but basically this is the last point at which we have any branches before very recently. So we have a big gap between 3,000 years ago and basically 400 years ago. And so this group here, the RS116 down in Spain, they completely obliterated every other male that was there before them. There was no other males survived. There was actually just a report came out there the other day. They moved into that area about 4,000 years ago, and every other male, whether they murdered them or they just wouldn't allow them to breed, there are no other descendants of any of the males that were previously there came true. So the women stayed, by the way, but the men were all gone. And pretty much the same thing happened in Ireland. We have this RL21, which if you've ever heard of Night of the Nine Hostages, he's a clan or a sub-branch of that L21. So there's another branch below that called M222, and if you test and you become an M222, it means that your ancestor back in the 5th century was the Nine Hostages. Or there's other branches which are aligned to the Dalcash and the O'Briens, and so there are lots of families that have very specific branches of this DNA that will actually say this is exactly where you're from, or exactly who your ancestors were. Unfortunately, we're not one of them. So this is the makeup of the modern Irish male. About 12% are the I haplogroup, which were those first guys to come to Ireland. Only 1% of those Neolithic farmers are still around. We have 81% are the invasion that we took part of, and then you have some other branches there which were basically Roman or British invaders. You might notice that E haplogroup, which I said was in North Africa, they became Romano-British, so the Romans brought them up there. And the R1A is a Viking or a Norman, and as you can see, the Costello surname, they're supposed to be Normans, but they should be R1A, or actually if you see over here, there should be I, and we're neither, we're R1B, so we're not Norman. So what are we? And so this is a mixture between the haplo tree and also the different groups of the project. So we have a group that are in Clare of Costello. So this green line here is when the surname was adopted, and you can see that there are basically 6 different lines coming into it. So in effect, the 6 different groups all have separate ancestors. So the last place we share an ancestor with these 2 groups is 4,500 years ago. The last place we share, this is us here by the way, the last place we share an ancestor with those 2 groups is 6,500 years ago, and the last place we share an ancestor with them is 47,000 years ago, long before the Costello surname ever came into existence. So this group are the only Costello group that actually are likely to actually have a Scandinavian origin. So if the theories of the surname are correct, at the minute they're the most likely candidates to actually be the proper Costellos, or the original Costellos. So we trying to figure out, well, where the hell did we come from? So we had a look at when we could find the earliest Costellos in Kilkenny, and so in 1472 we found there was Philip Mac Costello in the Ormond Deeds, and he was based around Thomastown and Knocktofer, or a lot of the stuff that was happening that he's on the page with were in Thomastown and Knocktofer. Then in the Liber Primus Kilkenniensis, my own uncles will be very happy with this. We had a Patrick Costello who was held the garden outside the castle gate, but you'll be really happy with this. He was actually the holder of St. Patrick's Gate, so he was a village man. Much to my chagrin, I should have been a borough man. But anyway, so we have this Patrick Costello in 1498 and 99 held the St. Patrick's Gate, and he held it again the following year. So these are some of the earliest mentions we have of Costellos in Kilkenny. So we were trying to, well, sorry, there's also another one. We have John Costello, who was a tailor, who was given freedom to trade into town, and it says without further molestation from said sovereign and community, and Finbar assures me that that molestation would have been quite physical, so he was going to stump up his 4 shillings to make sure he was a free man or free to trade. So I then had a look for some other possible mentions of Costellos, and what I found was this is a deed about a place in Ahaviller, and Ahaviller it has this place called Adboli Kostolowski in 1310, and so it's possibly could have something to do with Costellos, but we don't know, but it's a possibility. I then found another mention of the same place, Adbol Kostolowski, that dropped the T this time, in 1340, but it's the same area, and we see that there's these families called Murdochs, Seychelles and the Baths, and one of the things I forgot to mention, but on our DNA, that last group that we have before our current group, which is 3,000 years ago, that's populated to a huge extent by Scots people. Now it doesn't mean that we were in Scotland, but if we were, Murdoch seems like a Scots name to me, and the question I would pose, and I have absolutely no proof of this, or it's only a wild theory, is were we possibly a descendant of a Murdoch, a Seychelles or a the Bath, and were living around Adbol Kostolowski and decided to take the Kostolowski name and become Costellos. It's probably complete brouhaha, but it's the only thing I've come up with so far. So again, what we have is we have a couple of different groups in this, and this top group here is actually if we could read it, it says the southeast of Ireland, and so there are a few different people there in that group. There's 7 of us in that group. Myself and my uncle Martin have tested, and we're both there. And then we have a few Costellis, Anetum, and Castos. And so this is again. So when I actually did the YDNA test, I went from having 30,000 matches on the ancestry test to 11 matches on a YDNA test. So on my father's line, there's only these people are related to us. And so as I said, there's Costellis and Castos, and I'll just point out one number here. Myself and these guys have tested very far. I've tested up to 700 of those short tandem repeats I was on about earlier, and in 429 and 406 with those 2 people we have only 5 mutations, and so that basically suggests that within the last 500 years myself and those 2 men have a common ancestor. And it's not that the common ancestor was 500 years ago, it's in the last 500 years, so it's any time in the last 500 years. And I'll go through some of the history now as to we have an idea of exactly, or not exactly, but more or less when that separation occurred. So as I say, we have 1 Costello, 5 Castos, a Costelli. This Needham is actually a Costelli. They were actually adopted, and so they're actually a Costelli. We have a Hillman and a McDaniels. That McDaniels might actually be a case of an NPE, because an area in East Tipperary was where a lot of the McDaniels were, and there was also a lot of Costellos nearby. He has Costello DNA, but he has the wrong surname. I'm not saying anything. It's possible. So the Castos are from this area in New Jersey State. It was actually originally called West Jersey, and so it's around the areas of Cumberland and Salem counties. It's nothing to do with the Salem up in Massachusetts. But the Castos, they have records of them being there in the 1712 and 1721. So they were there quite early. But they were neighbours with a group called the Shepherds. And the Shepherds can trace their ancestry back very well to Ireland. And so they traced their ancestry back to a man called Thomas Shepherd, who fought for Cromwell. He was a Baptist, and in the 1640s he fought for Cromwell. In 1649 he came to Ireland. And so when he came to Ireland, he was garrisoned in a place called Castle John. And so this blue area here is the townland of Castle John in Tipperary. And so he was garrisoned there in 1659. He was eventually given it in 1666 and 1,400 acres to go with it. And so that's all well and good, and essentially what difference does that make? But this area here in red, about 100 odd years later, was absolutely full of Costellos. So I would assume 100 years before that, there was probably a fair few Costellos there as well. The Shepherds were, as I said, were Baptists, and they were persecuted just like the Catholics, but the thing was they had a bit of money, so they could get out of Dodge when they had enough of it. So they decided to up sticks, and at the time when they left, any of the Irish Baptists left and went to America, they actually brought the whole village, not the physical village, but they brought everybody in the village and went. And so the chances are is that a Costello was with them, had converted, or was just a good friend or whatever, and they all left in 1683 and ended up going and settling in that area there in New Jersey. And the Castos, who were the families thereafter, they settled in the same area. There's a man who's wrote a very big book on the Castos. It's called The Casto Family: An American Journey by Roy Casto. Myself and Roy have been in cahoots for the last while trying to figure out the connections, and so, as I say, within the last 500 years we should have an ancestor. We reckon that since 1600 that we would have had a shared ancestor with these Castos in America, and that one of the sons or grandsons joined the Shepherds and went west, and one of the other sons or grandsons stayed and became Pierce Costello in Kilkenny. And so we have a close enough connection. As you can see, Winegap is here, Kilkenny is here, and Goodwin's Garden is there. So Pierce was living in Goodwin's Garden but was buried in Kilkenny, so why was he buried there? And at the time, the tradition at the time would be that he would be buried where he were from, and so one would assume that he's from this area. This little area here is called Catstown, and Catstown was also full of Costellos. And if you remember back to the Adbol Kostlowski, that would be about here. So we kind of get a picture of Costellos in this area from possibly back to 1300, but definitely since the 1600s. And so that's kind of where I reckon we've come from, and until more people test, we can't fill in the gap. So this is about 4,500 or 4,000 years ago. This is 400 years ago when the Castos and ourselves split off. There's nobody has tested in here, so until more people test and we can create more branches, we won't be able to figure out exactly where we were in the intervening 2,500 years, which is nothing. Does anyone have any questions? Because it's very confusing the first time you hear it or see it, and I'm sure I've confused the hell out of all of you, but if any of you have any questions, there's no stupid questions when it comes to DNA, because it's Yeah.
How do the people that you're missing in that section there, how do you get there? You say they haven't done DNA testing.
Yeah.
How would that happen?
At the
Just
minute,
more people in the world test.
yeah, more people in the world just have to test. The vast majority of people who have tested are actually in this R haplo group, because the R haplo group is pretty much all of Western Europe, all the males in Western Europe. So all the men who would have, huge amount of men who would have went to America and Australia, and so the Western countries where people are likely to have the money to do these tests. So there's a disproportionate amount of people that have actually tested are actually in this R haplo group. At this point here, there's about 5,000 branches below this point here. From that point there down, there's only 5 branches. So there's only 100 people have tested from there down. So there's actually, then there's about, I think, 7,500 at this point. This is the next branch of it. So we go from being on the major branch of the R haplo group to a very, very minor branch. And so it won't actually be probably people with the Costello surname that will help us fill in the gaps. It'll be people with God knows what surname, but we won't know until they test. Yeah?
Does it make any difference whether it's men or women who test?
Only men can do a YDNA test. You don't have a Y chromosome.
I'm sorry, I was...
Yeah, all right. Yeah. Only men, say, have Y chromosome, so men can't test. Women can't test for that.
The DNA on a certain website, like on a certain, to be on a line to get onto this.
Yeah, so for the YDNA, we use a website called Family Tree DNA, and in fact, if I haven't bored you all to tears, if anyone actually does want to do a YDNA test, they actually have a sale on for the next 2 days. I have codes if anyone wants one.
You get a code.
No, in fact, most of you would actually be pretty much useless.
I got a message about that.
Yeah.
They're messaging everyone.
Yeah. But it would actually be useless for most of you to actually test, because I've tested far enough. It really would be for somebody that's probably, say the Costellos of Wallslock, or the Costellos of, if there's any of the Costellos from Catstown or places like that, if they tested, then we could actually figure out when we separated from them, because it's most likely that we are related to them. But until some of those tests, then you won't actually be able to figure out when you're connected to them. Any other questions, or are we rolling on? Hopefully this is the more interesting bit. We might wake up.
Winding very much backwards to your Diangados,
Yeah.
and you're saying that they don't have any Viking or Norman type of lineage.
Well, not they don't.
Yeah.
We
But
don't.
We don't, but
Yeah.
assuming that they don't either,
Yeah.
just likely that they were Welsh people of the same origin as we are, as Irish people are.
Yeah, well, as I say, we don't actually know where we were for 2,500 years. So, we could be. Go back here to. So, the last thing we know is when we were actually this P312, they were the crowd suspected of building the likes of Stonehenge and the big monuments in Carnac out in Brittany. So 4,500 years ago we were there. 3,000 years ago we assume we were in pretty much the same area. When the Vikings came down here to be Normans, we could have been there. They might have taken us on board. We could be the line. But until more people test, and until we can refine some of those gaps in that 2,500 years, we won't be able to tell